So if you know, what should the average person be buying like in time right? Well, let me slow down. We were previously talking about a dramatic change in the system. Let's start from there. What does this change look like? Do you think we've talked a lot about like Balkanization? Yeah. Where the and I want to be clear on this. It's like the political factions basically choose their specific region and they break apart and move. Do you think it's something like that? What do you think we're looking at?
So, you know, first of all, I don't want to really be certain about this. I always find people who are absolutely certain to be a little, you know, if you got a head-scratching attitude about that, you know, I don't know, man, you haven't seen the future. But I think the interesting thing about information technology, whether we're talking about the Gutenberg press or whether we're talking about, you know, TCP/IP or Twitter or whatever, is that it connects people who are further and further apart with lower and lower latency. So if you want to look at like 1776, you know, people in different towns in Massachusetts had a lot more in common with each other than they had with people back in, you know, Wales or, you know, various parts of England, because they could only communicate with a few letters, you know, with a latency of 6 months or so. And so that made it very easy for the regions to sort of grow apart and have their own political cultures. And the weird thing about the high-speed connection we have is that we have, you know, two tribes, obviously red and blue, but then a lot more tribes. You know, if you go to, you know, some furry fandom thing, right, yellow, you know, you pick anything, whether it's, you know, Mustang engine, you know, modification community, or whether it's preppers, or whether, you know, it's anything.
Guns.
Yeah, you'll find that these tribes are geographically distributed. So I think that we might be headed to a world where the Westphalian nation state, where all of the nations have crisp little borders around them, is perhaps fading, and we're going to a new world where the tribes are interleaved and distributed across and on top of each other.
I've been thinking a lot about that dissolution of the nation state since about 2006, really since internet video, when I realized how powerful and connected we are now with video chat. Like, how do you see it happening without a... Because the downside was I don't want a one world government that's totalitarian. Right. Now I'm looking at more of a decentralized localization. I mean, you work with crypto. Like, how do you see something like that working?
Right. You know, again, you know, I'm going to say I can speculate since you're asking me to speculate. You know, if you go back to the medieval period, there was this interesting thing where there was less of a crisp boundary in the Westphalian sense. You might have somebody who was a, you know, the example I said before the show started is you could imagine that there was someone, you know, peddling out on the street, and the guards come up and say, hey, it's Sunday, you can't sell stuff. And he, you know, holds up his warrant and he says, you know, actually I'm a Jew, so I'm, you know, bound by different doctrine, right, religious code, but I'm also tied in a little bit to your political system, and I've got a warrant from the Duke who says, you know, yes, I'm a Jew with his permission, I'm doing things. And the answer is, oh, okay, so you're on the same territory as people who are under this other power, but you're under a different sort of chain of command.
Whoa.
And
I can't imagine that being a good thing.
You know, when the world changes, good or bad doesn't really matter. You know, it comes out of incentives. I think it might be a decent thing.
I think we're going that way.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the racial identitarianism from the establishment in this country, and it really does look like that's where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, you know, right now we're already in that. You know, one person at Harvard is under a different law than someone else, depending on, you know, his skin color, you know, his admission there, the behavioral norms that's expected, and everything else.
Or actually, you can't even get into Harvard if you're Asian, for the most part. So yeah, absolutely, different rules just based on what you look like.
And you know, there's little hints of that. You know, if someone is from overseas and they've got diplomatic plates, we're here, you know, not too far from D.C., and I saw that. So I think that polycentric law overlapping in the same geographic location is something that has happened before in the Middle Ages, and I think it could happen again. Not making a strong prediction. And this ties into, we were talking about anarcho-capitalism, and one of the sort of leading luminaries of anarcho-capitalism is David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman. And he's written a bunch of great books on the topic. The seminal one is The Machinery of Freedom, which was one of the books that, along with Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, really sort of created my worldview. But he's written some other good ones, Law's Order, and one I read a few months ago was Legal Systems Very Different from Our Own. So I'm not sure. We'll see what happens over the coming decades.
I could see like an augmented reality system where when you look around, people have like a different aura if they're under different jurisdictional law or something. But my wonder is, what if the power goes out? Would that system function? Could it function? Do you think it's something like that?
You know, what if the power goes out? It gets back to sort of robustness and anti-fragility. And, you know, I expect that long-term technology is going to stick around, and that we will be living in a hyper-networked world. So that sort of pulls in the opposite direction of the sort of localism and the anti-fragile homesteading that we're talking about. So I don't know. In investing, some people talk about a barbell strategy where you want to have a lot of your money in sort of safe, reasonable things like index funds, but you also want to have a small amount in really potential high payoff bets. This is the venture capital model. And politically looking towards the future, on the one hand, sort of, I hope for everyone has, human rights and the power grid stays up and the food supplies are good. But I also have sheep that I can eat in my own orchard, and I can make my own wine in case it goes bad.
I think we got to get off the grid. So we're getting off a centralized economy, centralized law, centralized electricity. It's got to be polycentric.
You know a lot about Rome.
I know some, yeah.
When Rome collapsed,
right?
The as you mentioned before, latency, distance between communications was a very long time.
Absolutely.
And then you end up with their own political cultures, and then you mentioned now we're in this new era of technology. It's going to be really interesting, in my opinion, just to elaborate on that idea, when you have one faction of people, maybe it's a family, and they're anarcho-capitalists, and they're online communicating with the anarcho-capitalist community. But they're decentralized. Their neighbor is a socialist. Their other neighbor is a conservative, free enterprise sort of, but still some government control. How will there be cohesive law if people right next to each other are just at odds?
It's a great question, and I'll take a stab at answering it. But I want to be clear that I'm not predicting that this is definitely the way it's going to happen. David Friedman talked about this, and he's the one who came up with sort of polycentric legal order. And what he said is, you, Tim, might subscribe to one legal system where you want to keep trespassers off your land. That's pretty important to you. Someone else might subscribe to a legal system that has a English right to roam. And then in England, apparently, if you've got a certain amount of land, you can't keep people off of it. They're allowed to just walk right across as the sort of traditional right of the Englishman. So what happens when these things come in conflict? Like one guy says, I've got an absolute right to walk across your backyard, and you say, I've got an absolute right to keep you out. And theoretically, someone who wanted to diss on anarcho-capitalism would say, well, and then of course you'd get a gun battle, and that's why anarcho-capitalism is the worst possible political ideology in the world. But in the real world, when corporations run into things like, you've stolen my intellectual property because I think that my patent on, how resistors work is, blah, blah, blah. And you say, no, I'm using a different thing. It looks similar, but it's not. We don't get guns and duke this out. We just hire lawyers and they settle it. So I think that would happen. Now the next parody is, okay, Travis is arguing that anytime two people have a disagreement about trespassing in a garden, like is there an easement or is there not, then there's a $90,000 lawsuit that takes 3 years. And I think there's game theory where when something is iterated, there is not a need to hash it out time and time and time again. Both sides see, really a negotiated solution here and some rules of the road make sense. So if you look at any place where firms interact, they either come up with their own laws or they come up with their own governance bodies to help them interact with each other. Because, if you look at evolution, animals don't battle to the death with each other. When you've got two rams and they both want to, dominate the herd of ewes, it doesn't make sense if one ram is aiming to kill the other because he's likely to get severely damaged in that. The utility maximizing compromise is some sort of dominance display and head bashing, and then one of them sulks off because he can live to try again another day. And I think people are not idiots. People do not get into gun battles.
But I somewhat disagree. We talked about the wacky laws, recently, where you've got some places where it's like you can't take a shower on Tuesdays, and it actually made sense because back in the day, the local aquifer was like, like they said, we have to have one day where nobody uses water so it can replenish a little bit. But now we have better water systems, we have tons of water, so we produce these laws based on the specifics that are happening in our areas. So you have a community, and they build a culture. They build rules and laws for each other, by each other, and sometimes in disagreement with each other, but understanding the problem. Hey, look, a bear keeps coming in, so we're going to pass a law. You can't have picnic baskets lying around wherever. Well, now you've got somebody who's on the internet, and he does not subscribe to any of his immediate community. When they go outside, they're clashing, and one guy's on nothing but socialist forums, and one guy's on nothing but, ANCAP forums, and so they're completely at odds locally. I don't necessarily think that they would just agree to resolve the solution because the resolution itself is part of the local community and culture and law.
That's a great argument, and I follow it, and it's convincing. And so now the great thing about pontificating while sitting on my butt is I can say, okay, if you didn't like that answer, I've got another one. And the other one is that just as the cost of information transmission is falling, the cost of picking up and moving your butt is falling. I moved from Massachusetts, where the local community and the norms and the politics were very much not to my liking, and I moved to New Hampshire 8 years ago. And
a lot of ANCAPs in New Hampshire.
There are. There's a joke. I don't know if I would necessarily say that I'm part of the Free State Project, but I'm certainly FSP adjacent, and I know a lot of FSP people. And there's a joke, what's the difference between a libertarian and an ANCAP? And the answer is, 6 months in New Hampshire. So, I think picking up and moving to be around people who are like you is a good thing. And there's a phrase, the great sort, which is mostly talking about demographics and mating, but I think that to some degree it's also happening geographically.
I completely agree. I mean, look at how many people moved to Texas recently.
Right.
Joe Rogan and Elon Musk announced it, but a ton of people, there's a lot of regular people that moved. And one of the things I've warned, though, is that while, Joe Rogan and Elon Musk they seem to be left-leaning individuals. I mean, Elon Musk calls himself a socialist, whether he is or not. I don't know. It's funny considering he's
a master troll. That's what he is.
Right. But the people they bring with them, when they move their companies and their jobs, they bring people with them in their periphery who are definitely not going to agree with exactly what happens there in Texas. But I digress. That being said, I do think there's a great sort happening. I mean, look, we moved effectively to West Virginia. I was living in New York City only a few years ago, moved to the Philly suburbs. Now we're in the mountains, essentially. Yeah. I say that because we're in the tri-state.
By the way, I loved the drive out here.
Oh, the deer. Every day I look outside, there's a family of deer doing their thing. And, I wanted to get away from the city. So we move closer and closer to people who are more and more like-minded. For me, I would say it's not necessarily that the people around here are like-minded, but we agree to leave each other alone, which is big.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where I keep finding the problem regarding this whole concept of decentralized law is if a community wants to pollute the air, because that can affect the entire globe if it's done on a mass enough scale. If they're pumping methane and carbon and radioactive materials up into the atmosphere to produce just pure industry, like hundreds of thousands of people, like for decades, could just destroy things like thousands of miles away.
China.
Or polluting the water, like the ocean, like dumping. So
a lot of the plastic waste. India and China.
I was going to go there next.
Yeah,
absolutely.
India and China, plastic waste.
We've got all of these rules against having, plastic straws in the U.S., and really it's all coming from just one small place.
So will we need a global, like an overseer?
So, my answer to this is that freedom can only exist on the frontier. And, America has got a really unique libertarian culture. You find a few libertarians in other places, but it's endemic to, the United States. And that's because of our culture. We ran into a, quote unquote, empty, which is, the Western Hemisphere was empty because of the tragedy of communicable diseases. But we evolved this idea of a frontier because we had a frontier, and that's why you can sort of never really communicate about some of these topics with people in other parts of the country. And so, if I may plug something else, Tim introduced me as an author, and the first things I wrote before the homesteading books were two anarcho-capitalistic novels, which pretty much have the thesis that we can only achieve freedom out on the frontier. So the first one is The Powers of the Earth, which won the Prometheus Award for Best Novel in 2018, and the sequel is Causes of Separation, which won the Prometheus Award in 2019.
I think you are correct about that with the freedom. The way I've described it is, how gases, the molecules, are bouncing around quite a bit, liquids a little bit, and then solids, they're rigid.
Yep.
When you look at big cities, I view it as a solid.
Yeah.
All of these individuals stacked on top of each other, and that room to bounce around erratically, that's your freedom.
Yep.
The more people surround you, the more you push, and it compresses your sphere of freedom. So it's a really, really easy way to explain it.
I love your analogy, and because I'm a nerd, I'm going to make it a little nerdier, which is the ideal gas law, which is PV equals nRT. And, it's a great analogy because one thing that happens when you add more molecules that have this kinetic energy, or when you crush them in tighter space, is the temperature goes up.
Right.
And yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Or the system expands.
Right. So we can go to the Carnot cycle that it pushes out, and the piston.
But we're talking about compression, so that energy is getting released.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to explain it is just playing the drums. That in order to play the drums, you need a massive sphere of freedom. You can't do it in the suburbs. You might be able to, but you have to get permission. You have to ask, hey, you guys mind if we're playing the drums? I know, the zoning laws say that the ordinance says I can be noisy until 10 p.m., but then your neighbors get mad at you, and then you're fighting with your neighbors. You talk to them, they'll say, okay, play the drums, but only between this hours, or make noise, but only between this hours. You can't play drums in the city.
Right.
You got one person above you, one to your left, to your right, and one behind you. And you play the drums, and they're going to be like, are you nuts? It's not about I can sort of hear it. It's you're literally banging next door to me. Like turn your music. It's a movie trope. So people are stacked on top of each other. There's no room for freedoms.
I absolutely agree. One of the, there's a dozen or 5 dozen reasons that I don't want to live in a city and I can't stand the city. But one of them is that I'm an introvert. And, I know people who often propose systems. Like I've got one friend who is proposing a hackerspace, and my answer to a hackerspace is I have a hackerspace. It's my garage, and I've got MIG welders and bandsaws and lathes and everything I want to do. And so anytime I want to do a project, the tools are there, and I'm first in line, and I don't have to wait for anyone else. And I think that one of the reasons that he likes the idea of the hackerspace is because all of these things are up for negotiation. We get to come together as a community and decide the rules for how we should do this. And we get to come together as a community. So what I would see as a cost, which is the interactions and the negotiations, is for him a benefit. And I think a lot of people who love cities actually love the fact that you have to negotiate everything. They talk about, a certain sense of community, and, and that's what makes New York City great. The fact that when, one person vomits on the subway, that everyone else helps everyone else walk around it. I don't like interacting, so if I want to play the drums and get my Neil Peart on, I don't want to have to talk to 10 other people about it.
Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.